let's start out the beginning. What was your entry into comic books?
My entry into comic books as a reader or my entry into comic books professionally?
Well, I did a little bit of background research. I didn't want to do too much because I didn't want to forget to ask you questions because I'm like, oh, it's already been answered. But I did a
Yeah.
little bit, and I noticed that you were talking about how you read comic books as a kid, like they were on spinner racks and stuff like
Yeah, they
that.
were they were every I was born in 55, so comic books were everywhere when I was growing up. They were very accessible. There were no comic shops. They didn't exist yet, but comics were next to bubblegum cards, comics were the most accessible media to a kid like myself, growing up.
At what point did you decide I want to do my own comics? I want to do my own art.
There were 2 points, one of which I've talked about elsewhere, which is when my, at that time, best friend, my next door neighbor, Mitch Casey. Mitch is a couple years older than me. Mitch and I were monster kids. We were both really into monsters, right? The Aurora model kits and all that. But Mitch was the first person I ever saw make a comic book. He folded a few sheets of paper and stapled them, and it like blew my mind. Oh my God, he's making a comic book. And that was kind of the point when I realized I could make comic books. And that was probably around the age of 6, 6 years old. And then, like a lot of kids in my generation, I kind of outgrew, what was available of 4-color comics. But the point where I really got serious was junior high art class. Our art teacher was a man named Bill Caffey, and I was keeping my own sketchbooks at that time, and they were really weird. I was a weird kid. No two ways about it. I was a weird kid, Dan. And
Well, weird is subjective,
well, okay, but I was a weird kid, and Bill Caffey caught a look at my sketchbooks, and he brought something into class, not to class. He brought something in to surreptitiously hand to me, which was a copy of Zap, and it was I believe it was Zap Zero, the Robert Crumb underground comic. And he said, "You can't tell anybody I gave this to you because I could lose my job," which was very true at that time. Um, and the first Robert Crumb story I ever read was Meatball, which is sort of a non-narrative anecdote of people that are suddenly getting hit on the head with meatballs, and it's like instant enlightenment. And that's just what Robert Crumb's work did to me. Like when I read, my first Zap, it made me realize I'd been wearing blinders up to that point in my life, that I only thought comics could be a certain thing. And Crumb showed me by his example, comics could be anything, that anything you could think of, if you could put it down on paper, it was comics. And that was the real breakthrough. That was the point when I went, this is what I got to do. From that point on, it became my obsession. It didn't make any sense to, I had good friends in high school, and it didn't make any sense to any of them, but a lot of my friends were supportive because they found, what I was putting in my sketchbooks and sharing with them goofy and weird. And my parents were supportive to a point, but I didn't deviate from that moment on. And the third big influence was, my best friend in high school committed suicide when I was on my year off between graduating high school in '73 and deciding whether I was going to go to college or not. And when that happened, I realized, this is life and death. Like if I don't try to make comics, if I don't try to get my work out there, I'm going to regret it for the rest of my life. So that's when I got really serious. Not to be morbid, but that was the point where it went from being a preoccupation, a hobby, to real obsession. Like, I have to do this, and I have to give it my best shot. So that was what, 74. And by the winter of 75, 76, when the Joe Kubert School was announced, I was in college at that point, upper Vermont. Johnson State College, which no longer exists as Johnson State College. Um, and I had a couple of friends there, one of whom, the late Steve Perry, was the one who showed me the announcement for the Kubert School in the Comic Buyer's Guide. And he said, "You're wasting your time here. This is where you need to be." And going to the Kubert School, really, Dan, was the beginning of my professional career.
Yeah, I always really wanted to go there. I ended up going to community college because that's all I could afford. And then I moved to New York to get an art career. And but at first I was all hyped into it, and then it came down with brain cancer, and everything kind of slowed
Oh,
down. And then my wife died of hit and run, and that really, like, not to be morbid again, like you said,
well,
but that
no,
put
but
a
this is
spark under
the,
my ass to get stuff out there.
yeah, yeah. I mean, these are the things sometimes it takes for us to get serious about who we are and what we need to do in whatever time we have here. So,
Right. So it was like I always wanted, first I wanted to go to VCU because Mike Kaluta went there and I was a big Shadow fan. And
oh
then
yeah,
I saw that my favorite art team ever was you and Taliban on those early Swamp Things. And I remember they blew my mind because up until then, like I always wanted to be an artist and I wanted to be a writer, but I couldn't decide between the two. And then I remember I read Watchmen and I was like, oh, you can do both. Because
oh
these are
yeah.
like well developed stories. Like until then, I always read comic books, but they were always like little quick stories. And then, but I read Watchmen and I thought, well, the writing is really good, but the art doesn't grab me as much. I mean, it's good art, it's just it wasn't my thing. And then I saw the early Swamp Things with you and Toddlebin, and I was like, oh my God, this blows my mind. This is so good. And you guys were doing something that I'd never seen before. It wasn't like that standard comic book panel. It was like you were all over the place, but it all flowed together.
Well, at that time, my modus operandi, Dan, was to smash the page. I had been working in comics. We started on Swamp Thing in '83, and I had started working professionally in '77. So I had 6 years under my belt, and I hated that rectangle. I hated that 10 by 15 rectangle that every American comic book page essentially was, with few variations. So my modus operandi, by the time I was working on Swamp Thing, always the imperative is to tell a story and to tell the story as vividly as you can. But I also wanted to push what was possible with that page. And I wasn't the first. John Toddleben and I, as a team, we weren't the first to do it. Certainly, John was really influenced by the work that Neil Adams had done in the late '60s, early '70s at DC Comics. Comics like Deadman in Strange Adventures, Green Arrow, Green Lantern. My angle of attack was from the underground. So I had mentioned to you earlier that it was Zap that really, boom, my meatball moment. My favorite, the team that made me realize that telling horror stories in comics was what I had to do, was the underground comic team of writer Tom Veitch and artist Greg Irons. And sadly, neither of them are with us any longer. Tom passed away earlier this year, and Greg passed away years ago. But they were my role models. They were my heroes. They wrote and drew horror stories in comics like Skull and Slow Death, and their own horror comics like Deviant Slice that, hit me in a way I didn't think was possible in comics, that I knew was possible in movies because I had by then seen horror movies that, really did it to me. But I didn't think comics could do that. And Tom Veitch and Greg Irons proved me wrong. And so whatever we were channeling that you picked up on, for John as an artist, John's role models as an artist initially as a pen and ink artist were Frank Booth and Virgil Finley. Franklin Booth was one of the originators of the pen and ink use of pen and ink to try to recreate the look and texture of etchings. And Virgil Finley, the great pulp science fiction illustrator.
Yeah, no, I'm
Um,
well familiar with this stuff.
yeah, so those were John's illustration heroes, two of them anyway. And he also was very much inspired, not just by Neil Adams, but John was and is a huge Bernie Wrightson fan. I loved
Well, I
Bernie's
think
work.
most people are.
Well, yeah, I loved Bernie's work, but it didn't shape my approach to comics the way that Tom Veitch and Greg Irons' work did. Um, I, you've seen my work. I have like a looser meteor line. Like for me, drawing is a really organic process from the
Right.
inside out. And for me, my role models as an artist, in terms of artists who I wanted to draw like that, is the holy trinity of Sam Glanzman, Joe Kubert, and Greg Irons. And no error, they were all masters of brush and ink. And it was the moment. I mean, Rick Veitch talks about it what being like, lightning striking, that it was that visible to my classmates that the moment a Winsor Newton Series 7 watercolor brush was put in my hands at the Kubert School, I took off. Like that was the tool I didn't know existed in the world that was my drawing tool. And it was Joe Kubert, who put that in my hand. And I think within that first week, I was trying to draw everything with a brush because it felt so right to me. So what you were picking up on Swamp Thing was this merger of, John and I were working on the comic before Alan Moore was on the title. We were working with writer Marty Pasco originally, starting with Swamp Thing 16. John and I working as a team, we had very different sensibilities, but our work meshed perfectly. We had been jamming on individual drawings and ideas from the time we met at the Kubert School. Once Len Wein called us and told us Alan Moore was on board, that was it. We had been reading Alan's work in Warrior, the British comic anthology magazine, where Alan was doing Marvel Man, later to become Miracle Man here in the U.S. And
Copyright issues, but yeah, that stuff's
yeah,
brilliant.
but what really excited me, much as I loved Marvel Man, was V for Vendetta. What
Oh, it's
Alan Moore
awesome. Yeah.
what Alan Moore and David Lloyd did was just, incredible. And so when Len Wein called us and said, "Hey, there's a new writer in the book. You've never heard of him. It's Alan Moore," and I don't think Len believed John and I at first, and we went, "Oh, heard of him? We read everything he does, And we swapped letters in the mail. This is long before the internet and home computers. We were corresponding by mail, and Alan's first letters to John and I crossed in the mail with John's and my first letters to Alan. And we were all on the same page with what we wanted to do with Swamp Thing. Like we all wanted to take Swamp Thing to this different level that we had never seen the character at before. And because of Alan, Len, co-creator of Swamp Thing and our editor on the book, gave his blessings. He said, "Okay, run with it. Prove to me, this will work." And with issue 21, the script, when it came in, Alan proved, and I don't think we ever did better work than we did on that first collaboration. Swamp Thing number 21, the anatomy lesson, really was a breakthrough work. And I still look back at it as, did we do that? Yeah, we did do that.
No, I think it's brilliant work. And it really, like I said, it blew my mind when I saw it. And there were people I was familiar with, like Al Williamson and stuff like that, and Bernie Wrightson, I loved his stuff, but it looked a little bit cartoony. And that was the first time with the team of you and Taliban where it actually looked like real and terrifying, and, with Al Williamson, it's good, but it's still that frame, where it's like that square format with panels. And you kind of like broke all the boundaries with that. Like to this day, I still think that combination of you and Taliban, like you had the energy and the drive, and he would put in a little bit of the refinement. I think that was an amazing team.
Well, thank you. John put in all the refinement. I have to tell you. I mean, what John could do with a pen nib and with a brush, and it just flowed out of him. I mean, he was just, from the time we first met him when he started at Kubert School. John started the year after my class, Rick Beach, Tom Yates, myself, and our classmates. The second year John came in, but right from the get-go, John could draw circles around all of us as an illustrator. He didn't have the storytelling chops yet, and but that came, and I know because John has told me so that it was our collaborating on Swamp Thing that really upped John's game as a storyteller. And by the time John and Alan broke off to do their run on Miracle Man, there was
Just
nothing that,
amazing.
yeah, there was nothing that John couldn't do at that point. I mean, he had completely absorbed and mastered any aspect of page breakdowns that I had originally brought to the team as being, sort of my forte. John had absorbed all that and could take it further. Again, you look at my work as an artist, as an illustrator, as a cartoonist, and I'm a much rougher. I don't have the attention to detail. I don't have the love of the line that John has. John will put in whatever time is necessary to make those Swamp Thing pages, 5-10 times better than my pencils were. But I
But you
knew
had the
that
energy. You had the
I
like.
had the energy. I had
Yeah.
the energy, and John and I were close enough and had worked together enough that I knew when I was drawing with the side of my pencil. When I put my lead pencil on its side and I was doing lines with the side of the pencil, the kind of thing that would have confused any other inker. I knew that John would know what to do, and John always, brought it to
Because you
life.
guys were friends, so you kind of have a similar mindset.
Well, it was organic. I knew where we were similar mindset, and I knew where we were not similar mindset, but I could pencil to that, right? Like I knew. I'll give you a crude for instance, like John does, like myself, John does not have a love for drawing buildings, drawing cars, decaying buildings. Yeah, John loves drawing decaying buildings. But so I would put in the extra time on my pencils when it was, lived in environments, interiors of an apartment or that kind of thing, because John would stick to my pencils and bring it to life. But
Kind
I
of
also knew,
architecture and like perspective sort of stuff.
yeah. But I also knew that whatever I penciled on Swamp Thing, John was gonna, make it more lichen and moss than I could ever put down with my lead. So I would tend to draw the figure of Swamp Thing, and the facial expression, the body language is what I focused on, because I knew I was wasting my time trying to detail all the foliage and the vegetative patterns on Swamp Thing, because John was going to do what John was going to do with that. So it was really, it freed me up as a penciler to focus on the storytelling, the energy of the drawing, the composition of the page, the flow of the panels. And I also have to add, Dan, we were working full script. I had worked with Marvel Comics. I've worked the Marvel method, where you get a plot, you lay out the story, you're essentially doing half the writer's job. And then after the fact, the writer and or editor place the word balloons and captions.
Yeah, I was going to
Working
ask you about that. How much they interfered with your drawing?
Well, yeah, because you never knew what they were going to cover up. You never knew how much purple prose was going to go down there. I mean, you were really drawing sort of half blind, because you could compose a page that flowed visually as a series of images, but depending on where the captions and balloons were placed, it could completely destroy leading the reader's eye. Working full script from Alan Moore's scripts, I had total control over the page composition. I placed the captions. I placed the word balloons. Those are just as important to leading your eye as a reader than anything I draw there as an illustrator. So I could completely control the reading flow, the design flow, the composition of every page, every panel, and cumulatively how they read. And that was a freedom I had not had on those handful of jobs I did with Marvel, where I really didn't know what they were going to do in 9 times out of 10. But this also meant that I could experiment with ways of storytelling where I was certain when I turned in those pencil pages that those pages read, that those pages worked, that it worked. And, Alan's scripts were a constant, very positive challenge because Alan always was upping his game. And that prompted me to up my game, which prompted John Tottleman up his game, which prompted Tatiana Wood, who was the colorist on the book, and she was always the last in line in terms of, the last set of hands working on the artwork collaboratively. Tatiana Wood always turned in a stellar job on Swamp Thing. So, it really was the sweet spot of a creative team, all of whom were not just in synthesis, had a chemistry together. It was also a creative team where in each stage of the completion of an issue, every one of us was trying to improve the work of the person who had come right before. And that made it, constantly fun to work on. It was great. It was great. It was fun. I'm glad it came across to readers like yourself.
What did you think of the deluxe edition recolors? Have you seen
Um,
those?
yeah, and I have to be careful what I say, not in terms of being, politic or anything, but I do love what Steve Oliff did with the those books. I understand the business reason that DC Comics did it, right? Because they're trying to they're in the part of what publishers do these days, is they're constantly repackaging older work, but they're having to present it as new work. Just
Right.
like you and I will run out and buy a Blu-ray of some movie we already have on VHS
Right.
and DVD because of the bonus features. Well, I understand. That's part of what the Absolute Swamp Thing editions were all about with the recoloring. However, it was also kind of like, I don't know if I could listen to the Beatles music I grew up with if they wiped Ringo Starr's drum off the tracks and replaced Ringo with a brand new drummer. Even drummers I love, like Billy Cobham. Like, I don't want to hear Billy Cobham playing on the Beatles tracks. And
I know, I hear you. Yeah.
it kind of felt like that when Tatiana's work was no longer part of the package. I understand all the reasons, but I also think that in reprinting comics that were done in the past, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, there have been a lot of errors made. And Tatiana Wood's colors were designed to work on newsprint. When Tatiana laid down a yellow, it wasn't the yellow that she was putting down, the Dr. Martin dye she was putting down on the photocopy that was going to reproduce. She knew what full strength 100% yellow looked like once it was printed on newsprint, which just drank up the ink.
Right.
So Tatiana was coloring those stories with a clear perception.
View of the format. Yeah.
Well, not just the format. She also understood that putting down a color in, high octane, full strength, it was going to get knocked back in terms of value. There are different aspects of color theory. One of them is value, which is sort of the gray quotient of a color. And the value of a 100% yellow is not 100% yellow once it's printed on newsprint. And Tatiana Wood knew that. The problem, starting in the late 80s when DC began reprinting our Swamp Thing work on white paper, is it suddenly distorted all the color work Tatiana had done. Because if you print 100% yellow on pristine white Mando paper, that is not the same color you get on newsprint. And it means that every reprint edition, all the paperbacks, the hardcovers, they were misrepresenting what Tatiana Wood had done. And they were thus misrepresenting the end product that the team of Alan Moore, Rick Veitch, Steve Bissette, John Tottleman, Tatiana Wood, what we were putting together, and our letterer, John Costanza. And it was really Tatiana's part of that collaboration that suffered in every reprint volume. So having another colorist come in and recolor the work makes perfect sense. And Steve did
because
that
of the
work.
higher quality paper.
Well, the higher quality paper, audiences of comics today have now had, Image Comics and Malibu introduced computer color back in the 90s, and that changed everything with how comic books were colored. And we're now, 2 generations along from that. So recoloring the work with full, the full digital range of the kind of color work that Steve Oliff can do makes perfect sense. And he was very conscientious about referencing Tatiana Wood's work and emulating it where appropriate and taking it in his own direction when he saw fit. The only aspect of it there's two aspects of it I will express a certain concern with. One of them is we did a lot of use of negative space when we were doing Swamp Thing.
Right.
It meant something if I drew a caption border around one of Alan Moore's captions, but it also meant something if there was no caption border around that, if it was just floating in space.
And I loved when you guys did that, because again, that broke the like traditional comic book, genre foundation. It's like it all flows. It really tells the story, but it didn't feel like it's formulated and put on the page.
Right, but it also changes that voice a little bit, right? If the caption boxes disappear and a concluding caption, like the end of that issue of Swamp Thing where he's got his arms up and the sun is coming up behind him,
which by the way is to this day still my favorite illustration. I love that illustration.
Thank you very much. Mike Parkins just ended his run on Swamp Thing, and they concluded their run with his recreation of that page, which is like wow. But when I leave out that caption box, it meant something. And in some aspects in the Absolute Swamp Thing, the colorist was making caption boxes where we did not want caption boxes. And
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
That it's a minor thing, particularly to readers. 99% of readers won't notice it. But for me, it was a glaring issue. Like but I have to say, John Tollivan and I were invited early on to take a look at the colors as they were being done, and I chose not to. So, my bad. I might have been able to say, hey, don't put a box around that, and I chose not to participate in that process. The other aspect is, and this is true of a lot of CGI movies these days too, is for some reason this muted palette has become very fashionable in almost all media right now, like toning down the range of colors and so on. And
every trends come and go, so
yeah, but for me it's an aspect of kind of it's one thing if you're working that palette for an emotional effect. It's another thing when it becomes sort of a dull, suffocating veil over everything. And there were points in the Absolute Swamp Things where I was like aching for a splash of really bright, red or green or yellow or just something to pierce that gloom.
I hear what you're saying. It's like an emotional response.
Yeah, but it is an aspect of our culture. I can't lay that all at the new colorist's feet. It's something that's become very characteristic of the 2000s, the last 2 decades, where just look at movie promotional art, look at the patina of most motion pictures these days, even the ones that are slam bang pop in terms of the kinetics of their editing, but the color palettes all are sort of dulled down. And anyway, so that's neither here nor there. It's just one of the artifacts of the current Zeitgeist, and I accept it as that. That's just that's tenor of the times. But the biggest thing for me, Dan, is it's not Tatiana, and she was as much a member of the original team as the rest of us whose work is still visible there on those pages. So it's a little bittersweet in that regard, but I am in no way casting aspersions. I'm very happy with the Absolute editions, and it's incredible to see the work preserved in that format in that way. So
I had the original paperbacks. This is going way back. This is like the late 80s, but I had
those first paperbacks. Yeah.
And like now I have the Absolute editions, but I just shot my shop burned down and it took everything with it. So when I rebought it, I was like, I'll buy the Absolute edition. I love that stuff. But I guess I wasn't even seeing the way they Tatiana originally did it when I saw the paperbacks, because it wasn't even the same paper.
Yeah, and the paper changes everything. You know, we were working on Swamp Thing when that changeover was happening. Uh, I'll name a comic that you'll remember, but a lot of your listeners will have no recollection of, which was Camelot 3000, right?
I remember that well. Yeah.
Okay, and DC put that out, and I think that was their first or one of the first. You
I
know,
think Brian Boland did that, right? Like
Brian Boland did the
yeah.
artwork, and it was designed to be printed on pristine white Mando paper, Mando. Now, DC was starting to experiment with that new paper in a number of other books, and the first of our work that was printed that way was Swamp Thing Annual #2. Right? They printed it on that better paper when it first came out.
Okay.
And I remember both John and I were like, whoa, you know, like the work really looked different on that paper. And Tatiana, you know, colored that annual with the same attention to detail, with the same values that she colored all the prior issues. And it did not represent what she would have wanted. So we understood as we were working on Swamp Thing that this change in the paper could have a future impact. Now, remember, at the time we were doing Swamp Thing, Dan, there was, you know, DC was not reprinting. The only time they ever reprinted one of our stories during the time we were working on the book is DC used to do those little, you know, end of the year digests of the year's best stories. That they used to sell like at supermarkets with the Archie digest and stuff.
Right, right.
And they did reprint.
I remember those. I'm old. Yeah.
Yeah, they did reprint one of our Marty Pasco stories. In fact, I think it was Swamp Thing #16, which was Marty's homage to Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone. And that story got reprinted in the Little Digest. You know, that was the only one of our work that was reprinted when we were actually working on Swamp Thing. Then when they did that first collected paperback, I believe the introduction was Ramsey Campbell on the first of the Swamp Thing paperbacks. That's when we first saw how our work looked different. You know, the stories that had come out in newsprint on the whiter paper. And we realized right off, there were two problems with the reprints. One, the colors changed, even though they were still working from Tatiana's color guides. And number two, our double page spreads don't work anymore. When you remove the ad pages from comic books, you know, I would get a script. I would get the new script from Marty Pasco. I would ring up Len Wein, who was our editor at that time, and I would ask Len, where do the ad pages fall? And Len would tell me. He understood why I was asking, because I wanted to know where the double page art spreads were in the comic.
They sell sea monkeys and stuff like that. They were just
yeah, exactly, right. And when you take out those Reese's Pieces ads, suddenly a page that was not facing another page is facing another page.
Right.
And if you look back at those paperbacks, that was the other problem. Like they would insert a pinup, one of John Tolman's and my pinups out of nowhere to get the pages back in the order they needed to be in with the double page spread. That said, even with the care that was put into those paperbacks, there is a double page spread of Rick Veitch's issue of Swamp Thing, the one that introduced John Constantine, where there's a double page spread they have almost never reprinted correctly. And so it doesn't read correctly. Rick designed it to be read across the top of both pages, and then you go back and read the next tier. When they take those pages and move them from being facing pages to one page after the other, it doesn't Right.
I remember seeing those things and being like, this isn't, you know, it doesn't look right. This, you know, I didn't buy them actually because I'd see them and I'm like, this is the real thing. I mean, I was a snotty little kid, but you know, these are the artifacts of our having done the work originally in periodical comics, the way comics used to be published. Now everything's being done very much with the collected edition in mind, so it's a whole different ball game these days. That said, you know, I don't know when they collect, you know, the current run on Swamp Thing, now that it's completed its current story arc with this collaborative team, how is that going to work when they collect it? I'm not sure. I'll be curious to find out.